First of all, thanks everyone for being here. I think I have never seen this room so full. So thanks. Of course. Thanks so much. So, and then, of course, thanks, Alex, for filling this room, actually.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
Yeah. So today we are very, very excited to have Alex with us to present this book, The AI Con. Such an amazing book. We are going to be talking about that, and we hope this is going to be very interactive. We are hoping for a lot of questions from you all, and also the people online on the live stream. Please feel free to post your questions. We will have someone reading some of them out loud. But first, I really properly want to introduce Alex. Dr. Alex Hanna is the Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute, or DAIR, and a lecturer at the School of Information at the University of California, Berkeley. She is also one of the two authors of the AI Con, the book that we will be discussing today. The other author is dear Professor Emily Bender, who is not here, sadly, today. But yeah, we will still have
She's
fun.
in the room in the text.
And exactly, she's in spirit here. Okay, also briefly, my name is Milagros Miceli. I lead a research group here. I am also research lead at DAIR, at the same institute as Alex. And I'm very, very excited about this conversation. So I would say we just start.
Let's do it.
Okay. I think my first question has to do with I'm going to take the keywords from the title. And I want to know, the keywords to me are, of course, AI, but then also con, in connection with AI. And then the word hype, which is not only part of the book, but also the work that you and Emily do in terms of the podcast that you all have in terms of, demystifying a lot of the hype around AI. So let's start maybe defining those. What is AI and why is it a con?
Yeah, absolutely. Also, thank you all for coming here. Really appreciate it on this warm and warming day. I'm really pleased to be here and in conversation with my dear colleague and friend, Mila Miceli. Dr. Mila Miceli, Professor Doctor. Sorry, I had to make a small German joke. And so, yeah, what is AI? So one of the things that we do in the text is to start understanding what AI is, because this term AI has become this term du jour. It's the word for a set of technologies and the boundaries are very vague. In kind of a previous era, there has been a kind of definition of AI in which AI is this very broad term, and internally within it is machine learning, and then however you define the Venn diagram or the circles. But then this term has become all-encompassing, and one of the things that we highlight in the book is that this is the word of the hour, but this is a rather recent development. Until about 2012, it wasn't even really a thing that had been used for these set of technologies. And so when we talk about AI, it's helpful to talk more about automation and to speak about what is being automated. So on one end, you could think about AI as being a terminology that talks about classification systems. And that is specifically thinking about the tech itself. You could think about it talking about automated decision systems being used in public benefits, in healthcare settings, in social services. So that is more focused more on model outputs in the context in which they're used. You can think about them in terms of recommendation systems. And then you finally get to this notion of generative AI, which is really what we're focusing on, specifically large language models, and then text-to-image models, text-to-video models, and then models which are adopting a number of different modalities. It's helpful for that, and we follow a few other people like Emily Tucker and Lucy Suchman, and really focusing on what it means to talk about AI, that there's no unproblematic thingness. This is a term from Suchman, of thinking about what AI is, both as a sociological and as a sociological object, and also kind of this social phenomenon. And so one thing we do in the book, and we encourage in practice, is that if you're speaking about AI, it's helpful to put it in some heavy quotes or to imagine that. And this is something that Emily and I kind of sparred over often, because she'd really want to distance us from the term AI, so we'd either use quotes or say so-called. There's this one instance in which she used both so-called and quotes, and I said, Emily, you can't use both. There has to be a decision made. But it's helpful to be very specific about the technology. So large language models, to be specific about that. And in the book, when we talk about large language models, to be more specific even about what they're doing, we call them synthetic text extrusion machines. and then for videos, and if you want to be general about it, synthetic media extrusion machines. So to talk about what is being outputted specifically, and then it also gives you some idea of how they can interact with the world. So that's AI. Thinking about the con part of the title, and I appreciate this is a very sociological move, which is, what do you mean by AI? What do you mean by con? Define these terms, which is, it's also a nice philosophy move. And so the con, we talk about the con in multiple levels, and I almost like to think about this in multiple levels of action. So on the specific level, on the individual level, we think about what ideational work happens with AI, and what kind of con is operational there. And so we think about the ways in which there's a set of technologies that are in operation that output synthetic text, and there's an imaginary that they do a lot more than they are capable of. And so that is a con insofar as these are synthetic text extrusion machines which generate text according to some probabilistic distribution of what's in training data. And so the con is that it's an idea of thinking that these machines can do a lot more than what they're designed to do. And part of that ideational work is thinking about the ways in which they can, they're first anthropomorphized, and so there's a cultural reference to this notion of intelligence, in that these text generation systems can do a lot more than that. And so that con on one operates on the individual level. It also operates on the cultural level, thinking about the reference that it's being made to a notion of intelligence, but also the reference to other types of science fiction stories, narratives that are told about what artificial intelligence is and what it can do and why we should be scared of it. And then it operates on the political economic level, which is, kind of where these things all connect. And so the kind of story is, there's a cultural story about intelligence and about individual agency of these machines that is being woven to serve a set of political economic interests, which are really about power centralization, about data and compute accrual to a very narrow set of actors for profit and to reap windfall venture capital and investment. And then lastly, about hype. What is AI hype? There was a prior version, and I'm going to tell this here because we didn't get to use this in the book, and I really want to write some article about it. But there's a prior notion of what hype is, and I was trying to think about what hype operates as. In the book, we say hype is the aggrandizement of some technology or technologies for the purpose of getting people to get on board with it. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. Lest you, as a consumer, as a teacher, as a student, be left in the dust. And so hype operates on this fear of missing out, this FOMO. And there's some degree in which, and someone else wrote an article called ChatGPT is bullshit, and I wanted to kind of make this allusion in terms of like, well, if you take this idea of bullshit seriously, and this is the idea that like Harry Frankfurt writes about in his text on bullshit, there's a difference between the bullshitter and the liar. The liar like cares about the content of the truth claim, right? They're like, okay, here's a lie. I actually care that it's a lie. I know what the truth is. A bullshitter doesn't really care about the content of the truth claim. They're just like, I'm just trying to get to, I have an end, and I'm going to get to the end because I think there's some kind of bunch of tokens that can be muddled together in such a way that that's going to get me to where I need to be. And to some degree, hype is a nice part of the bullshitting machine, because hype allows you to really, it is different than bullshit because it is about a product. It is different insofar as you don't really care about the truth claims, but you want everyone to buy into this. So it's almost like a cousin concept. And so the hype in this set, in this way, it's a FOMO, it's a fear of missing out of this particular technology because it's going to be revolutionary, it's going to change every industry in many incredible ways. And in this way, you have AI plays this particular sort of hype, but we see hype bubbles in other domains, whether it's crypto, NFTs, blockchain. Those are other hype cycles, but there's some unique features about AI hype that are particular to AI, and that's a lot of what we do in the book to suss out what's different about AI.
Can you maybe explain what is the end goal of this bullshitting machine, as you call it? Like or let me rephrase, what is the purpose of the hype and the FOMO that is being instilled in people?
Right. So one of them is a political economic function. It's saying if we put AI on something, we're going to sell a bunch of it. We're going to get a lot of VC money, right? And there's different motivation. So that's sort of the easiest answer on this. It gets a little more complicated, and you're thinking about like what is the real promise of this. And so we can't ignore the political economic function of this, because hype has been incredibly lucrative. It's said that, in Q2 2024, according to PitchBook data, Sherwood News reported that half of all VC investment all VC investment went to AI companies. And I don't have an updated stat of what that is, but there's, it's been rather consistent of the amount of investment that's been going. And so that was to the tune of $27.1 billion in Q2 of 2024. The most recent funding round from OpenAI was the largest funding round we've seen for tech ever. $40 billion going to OpenAI, led by $30 billion from SoftBank. And now we have reports of Altman going for sovereign wealth funds from the Saudis and other very well-moneyed players. So that's, if you follow the money, that is one function of it. The second part of it is this, I think, a narrative that gets told a lot around productivity and a promise of productivity. Effectively, and this is a narrative that gets spun in so many different places. Dario Amodei, the founder of Anthropic, said, we're going to have this. I think he used this very visceral terms. He said, there's going to be a slaughter of white collar jobs. 10 to 20% of white collar jobs are going to go away. We're going to have this productivity. Productivity is going to go way up. So many jobs are going to be replaced here. We've had the same claims being made by Altman, by Andreessen. Name your tech guy. They've made that. And I think someone put it very well on Blue Sky when they said, well, what problem is generative AI trying to solve? And the problem is wages, right? And the problem is effectively offering some kind of labor market replacement, right? That hasn't borne out in practice. We don't have a lot of studies in one very large study that they did in Denmark, that was a National Bureau of Economic Research paper, they used employer data and looked at 25,000 employees across 7,000 organizations and those employees were those that were particularly exposed to automation, and found that there was a very limited labor market effect. So I think there was something like a 3% increase in productivity, but those were offset with new tasks that those workers had to do in kind of minding the generative AI tools. And then the corollary to that, which you are the expert on, is the way that AI is secretly still people, right? The way that this is another move towards outsourcing, towards the wave of the 90s to the move to business process outsourcing organizations, in which these things wouldn't be able to function at all if there weren't a huge hidden shadow workforce that allows them to function, right? And your work with the data workers inquiry has been invaluable in talking about this. And so that's another kind of element of that. And we've seen some of the players in this space, like Scale AI, others that are in this kind of Turing is another one, which has a very ironic name. But the kind of ways in which there is this move to not replace labor, but to displace labor, to move it someplace, either in people and employees that are already overburdened with other tasks, or to make it part of a BPO system.
Absolutely. So, it's working? Yeah. Now, so the way I understand it, then all three dimensions of hype can be summarized in terms of harms done to workers in a way. When you were talking about the first dimension and the part in terms of following the money, I had to think of, when we talk about data work, sometimes we talk about how data workers sometimes are instructed to impersonate AI systems. And what people always ask me is, why? Why would you have workers who actually are hired to make AI systems, to train AI systems to resemble humanity? Why would you put them to answer as if they were chatbots or AI systems? And actually, my answer is always, well, because AI sells. There are studies, I was reading this the other day, that show that if a startup says that they are going to have AI embedded somewhere in their business model, they tend to receive between 15 and 50% more investments than other startups that say, no, we don't need AI. Not everyone needs AI, right? So, sorry, let's call it so-called AI. Otherwise, Emily, who's watching, probably will be pissed at us.
I think you can just assume when we say AI.
Every time I say AI, it's so-called. Yeah. It's in quotation marks. Anyway, so I had to think of that, and then also the question of how the narrative and the hype of AI and product connected to productivity also is a very, very powerful disciplining tool, right? If you tell a worker that their productivity needs to get better, otherwise it will be replaced by an AI, which is not true. We are not seeing that at the big scale. But if you tell a worker and you instill that fear in them, then probably they will be more prone to do as the boss says, and to charge less for their work.
100%. Yeah, labor. I mean, and I think this is a quote from the book where we say AI is a labor disciplining device. It's not a labor replacement. It is something that is a cudgel that is forcing workers who are already maybe precarious to come to heel, right? And it's kind of interesting too. One foil that this operates really well through is the tech industry itself, in which the tech industry is so interesting because, at least in Silicon Valley, the way that this has been functioning is that you had this kind of era of of a very robust way in which tech workers were told that they were very specialized workers and that they could exit their company with pretty low repercussions. If you don't like what you're doing at Google, you can go to Facebook. If you don't like what you're doing at Facebook, you can go to Oracle, And so that itself was this era of, pre-COVID effectively. As layoffs then hit the tech industry in Silicon Valley very hard, that there was multiple rounds of layoffs, workers found themselves with fewer and fewer exit options, and then felt this very acutely. And then you had this era of generative AI in which these workers are then finding more and more of their work being threatened. And so there is a very strong narrative, especially from tech CEOs, that we are doing 30%, 40% of our work with AI, and they'll say that now. And Satya Nadella said something like that in an interview. And it's actually, but the story is that's first not happening. This is coming from Nadella, so he's reporting these numbers out of nowhere. You're seeing some reporting coming out. There was a New York Times article from their labor reporter, Noam Schreiber, and Noah Schreiber. He was writing effectively about how there was this real level difference. So junior developers were being hit very hard by this forcing to do more things with code generation technologies, whereas more senior developers were finding more ways to use it. And that is, or using it as a way, I'm assuming, to do and supplant their work with other things. That's also a very interesting narrative, and who knows how systematic that is. I mean, it's very hard to get access to these companies and understand that. The people within companies that are the most concerned about these are cybersecurity experts, because understand these cybersecurity risks have now exploded into thinking about ways in which people are often doing things like squatting on certain package names that are fake. And so if you're a Python developer and you're typing, import pandas, and which is a data analysis package, they might misspell it like Pam does, and then there might be some malicious package that can then be imported. And it's just become such an idiom, it then occurs like that. There's other things, because of the ways that these technologies work, they output idioms that are much more common in the training corpora, and rather than ones that are the most secure. And so there is this way, and you see this in different industries. Software, I think, is the one where it's the most maybe hyped up, but now we're seeing it a lot in medicine, especially in mental health. I find this ironic, in doing this at the Weizenbaum-Institut with looking at an ELISA-like thing. And so that's, this is this area which is, such a concerning area, but really finds its way in which, health practitioners and especially nurses have really been concerned about the incursion of these systems into their work.
Thank you so much for that. I would like to go a little bit deeper and maybe a little bit more depressing. Getting a little bit more depressing, because I want to talk about the connection of between hype, I don't know how to put this, but and the fact that the world is going to hell, and that we are facing multiple wars, genocides, the dangers of nuclear holocaust, and in all that, AI or so-called AI appears to have a very starring role. when it comes to AI and warfare, AI and border control, AI and surveillance. I was wondering concretely, what kind of political work does HYPE do in that context?
Yeah, no, this is a fantastic question. I wanna take it, and I wanna take the framing, and kind of take it and take a piece that we talk about and turn it on its head, because I want to talk about the way in which there's this narrative about existential risk about AI and how existential risk itself, and so this is the idea that AI is going to intentionally or unintentionally kill us all. It's either going to we're either going to be in a situation in which there's going to be a misaligned optimization function, and we're all going to be turned into paperclips, which is this famous thought experiment from Nick Bostrom, who wrote Superintelligence, or there's going to be a way in which there is going to be some kind of magical sentience, and then there's going to be a way in which there's the tool will defend itself in a way that finds humans to be not necessary anymore. And so that itself, and so in the book we called the split between these people boomers and booster. I think we say boosters. I think we say boomers and doomers. Boosters and doomers. I forget exactly. It's boosters and doomers. Although if we should have said boomers and doomers because that would have rhymed. Oh well. And so those both have a hype function. It's saying this tool. And Emily has a really nice phrasing of this, and I'll try to replicate it. So AI boosters say AI is a thing. It's inevitable. It's powerful, and it's going to save us all. And doomers say AI is a thing. It's inevitable. It's powerful, and it's going to kill us all. And so that's the distinction between the two. So the first three premises are the same. The last premise is misalignment. And so one of the ways in which there's a turn in the book, and I mentioned that as a foil because it's a useful way in which to think about, how it's a distraction from current harms. So the ways in which automated technical systems, socio-technical systems, do this work of harming the people who are already the most marginalized in society. And so to some degree, there's a way in which, this reminds me so much of, Bonilla. It reminds me so much of Eduardo Bonilla Silva's racism without racists. The kind of way in which you're saying we shouldn't talk about race because we're just going to treat everybody equally, and it's sort of saying. The existential risk people are we care about all of humanity, and we're trying to save all of humanity. And you're like, what about those people over there? What about AI for warfare? What about targeting systems? What about surveillance? What about border technologies that excludes refugees? Let's talk about biometric systems. Let's talk about the cache of data that organizations like the UNHCR is sitting on, or the cases in which Palantir is building databases for governments all over the world. Let's talk about the way in which Palantir is also serving as an interface for organizations that are targeting individuals. Let's talk about Elbit Systems and the work with Unit 8200. Let's talk about all these different ways in which there are systems that get built as AI and how it is normal, it is normalized. They all get, and that is fine. The process of war making, the process of the surveillance state, the process of putting a large language model on top of what are already caches, massive caches of data around the most marginalized people in the world are already being used to restrict movement, to murder them, to cause mass death. And these are not the concerns of existential risk. And so there's a very illuminating case in which Jeff Hinton, who features a lot in AI narratives, so called one of the quote-unquote godfathers of AI. Um, he was at Google the same time I was, and he left Google in a huff, and he said, like, I'm really afraid about existential risk. And so I think he was talking to Jake Tapper from CNN and said something like, and so Tapper asks about Tunisia Brew, the founder of DAIR, and how she was fired for talking about harms of large language models, about bias, about the ways that tools work worse for Black and brown people, for women, and Hinton dismisses it and says, "Well, I'm talking about all humanity, and these should be subsumed under my, under the claims of existential risk." And so, a few things as a reflection there. So one of them, that kind of narrative of serving all of humanity, then depresses this notion of actually existing harms, and also highlighting the necessity to be very specific about what we talk about when we talk about AI, because what are you talking about? What are these targeting systems doing? What kind of errors do they have? What data is being used with this? What is the presupposition of the data that we need to do any of this? What is being automated? In this case, the kill chain is being automated, right?
Thank you for that. You just gave us a lot of examples around the harms caused at the receiving end of this. And you also talked about before about how AI is basically fueled on exploitation, on the exploitation of workers at different levels. But also in the book you talk about how AI is based on or fueled by the exploitation of nature. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's again, I'm going to use another foil for the for the thinking about climate change and human-made climate change, specifically on due to carbon emissions. And this is this problem that has not enough political will behind it, but it is framed as a technical problem that could be solved by quote-unquote AI. And so this is a thing that gets advertised by Altman, by Eric Schmidt, former chairman of the board of Google, in which he has said, well, the climate's going to be screwed anyway. Let's just build large language models and have the large language models fix this for us. And so this is, premised first off that you need to scale large language models to such a degree that that because of these benchmarks that are being used by companies, they perform better and better on these benchmarks. We'll leave to the side that these benchmarks have very little ecological and face validity when it comes to actually measuring what they want them to measure. But this notion of scale then suggests that the thing that needs to be done is to build more and more data centers. And so data center construction has absolutely exploded everywhere in the world, in the West and otherwise. And it's also premised on so much extraction, whether that's water, rare earth elements, making specific land use deals with particular municipalities, and these municipalities often in places which are already resource starved. So there's been in the U.S., these have been in places like Northern Virginia, which is called Data Center Alley. The place that is actually has the largest increase after Northern Virginia in the U.S. is Maricopa County, which is in Arizona, so a very dry place, in which there are these water battles taking place. Karen Howe, in her book Empire of AI, she does some really great reporting in there where she travels to Chile and also Uruguay, looking specifically at water battles that land defenders are fighting against data centers, specifically on using potable water almost And in the case of this location in Chile, half the potable water of this area that is somewhat rural, about an hour outside of Santiago. And so there is a few dimensions to the environmental impact. There's the carbon impact, which some estimates have estimated have been 662% above prior baselines. There's the water usage. There's also the air pollution. This has been seen the most acutely in Memphis, in which a data center that was constructed by Elon Musk's XAI was functioning, was using 35 unlicensed gas turbines and was polluting an area of southwest Memphis known as Boxtown, which is black and poor, and in another instance of environmental racism. But there's also been a report that University of Riverside, in a paper led by Xiaolei Ren, which has shown that the areas in which data centers are being built are those that already are areas that are typically poor and already have a huge public health burden. And this is due to diesel engines operating as data center backups. So in their estimations, there's already something like, in certain locales, something like 500 to 1,500 excess deaths that could be attributed to data center construction. So this is air pollution. This isn't even the carbon outputs of these. And we're seeing that as being accelerating and accelerating. In the US, I think by 2026, we're going to hit, if current projections hold, there's going to be as much power required by data centers themselves as required by the country of India. And so we're seeing this go. And there's a lot of greenwashing that's happening in this as well. So Microsoft likes to advertise that they're going to reopen 3 Mile Island, the site of a nuclear meltdown in the 90s, which is in eastern Pennsylvania. And they like to pose this as a bit of a bridge technology. We're going to do nuclear. This is clean. This is not going to emit carbon. At the same time, this is greenwashing all the other energy that's going to be needed to actually make these data centers run. So that's going to be natural gas, it's going to be carbon, it's going to be coal, it's going to be other fossil fuel technology. And so there's so much happening, and there's so much intensity in the construction of these data centers, often in places that have laxer municipal political environments, and also ones that municipal managers are not really prepared to deal with. There was a great line in this reporting from Business Insider, which basically said, you've got this high-powered corporate lawyer going up from Dave from the Public Utility Commission, this guy that deals with small land use proposals, this one bureaucrat. How are they supposed to deal with this person that makes $500,000 a year, who's talks about all the kinds of benefits that are going to come to a particular locale by building a water treatment center, which is how the mayor of Memphis started to say, this water treatment center, we need this water treatment center, and also making appeals to jobs, even though these data centers do not actually produce that many jobs. It's something like 200 or 300 jobs for a data center, and these locales which are suffering environmentally or suffering economically. And so there's a whole constellation there, and there's a lot of folks doing very important work on this, including Mel Hogan and Tamara Neese and others.
What you're saying about data centers and the fact that they don't bring a lot of jobs and they bring more harms to communities than they bring jobs reminds me a little bit of the BPO industry in the space of data work, and how predatory they are, how they target specifically vulnerable populations, places where unemployment rates are high, so that they can go there and also be the good guys, right? Like they are the saviors. They come there and they bring jobs, and who's going to say no to that? Before we go into the Q&A, so please start thinking of your questions. I'd like to talk about the last chapter of your book, in which you bring a little bit of hope and bring up a couple of examples around what can be done to counteract this hype and this con that you call, how you call AI. And you do that in terms at the individual level and also at the societal level. What can we do as a community and what can we do individually? Can you maybe talk a little bit about that, bring some, but also I would like you to maybe bring some existing examples, if you know of some of them. For example, I loved when the part where you talk about the Luddites, and and how well you explain that Luddism is not about the rejection of technology, but rather a rejection of the instrumentalization of that technology by the powerful. I really loved how you explained that. But maybe you have other examples. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, thank you. That was a great, fantastic setup. So thinking about individually and collectively, it's a depressing book in some in some ways, but we try to bring some levity to the topic, and we do this in the same way that we approach our podcasts, Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000. If you got that reference, make sure to put some Ben Gay on your back before going to sleep. And so, so the individual way, we have a few different mechanisms. So one of them is just asking questions. So really thinking about when you're approached with a technology, try to understand what is actually being automated. That's a helpful question. So when you say AI, what are you doing here? What is actually being automated, and how is that supposed to work? So what are the inputs and the outputs? One of the example we talk about in the book is this company called Hippocratic.ai, which is supposed to do skilled nursing. And what they pose on the website are these AI-generated pictures of people, and then they give them some kind of a specialty. And when you actually dig into their website, it's very deceptive. But what the input is there is a quote-unquote nurse that gives people a call and is effectively an interactive voice that kind of reminds people to take their medication, or if they had some follow-up from a procedure, then ask them. But you could also imagine, and so that is not skilled nursing behavior. I mean, that is, if there are things that do not fit into the script, what is that technology supposed to do? It's not actually providing this output of nursing. And so it's actually very difficult when you go on their website to actually find out what is happening there, because they just look like they're avatars of nurses. So that's a second thing. What is the input? What's the output? Of course, the evergreen question of who built this, why did they build this, and to whose benefit? So this is an important question. And then the important questions about what are the labor effects? Where was the training data taken from? And how are these things evaluated? How do we actually know what success is? What are the different ways in which evaluation was undertaken? Can we see that evaluation? Can we see that data? Do you have details about work practices? If you had annotators and data workers, what were their working conditions and whatnot? So those are very helpful tools that people can take and use in their workplace, in civil society, to challenge governments, especially when governments are doing massive procurement of these types of tools, and as an engaged citizen, worker, and whatnot. We also encourage ridicule as praxis, which is kind of making fun of these tools. And we're seeing a lot of this online, I think, especially when you think about AI generated. Oh, was that a baby or a cat? Sorry. Not to put you on blast. And so really thinking about piercing through the cultural bubble. There was a great article from Tressie McMillan Cotton, who focused on, she wrote a New York Times article saying that AI is mid, really focusing on how the outputs are very mediocre. And I think there's ways in which that is connected to the question asking of really identifying the ways in which the outputs of these systems are very cheap. They're not a sufficient replacement for human work, activity, and relationships. So those are two individual practices. Collectively, there's a few different practices. Collective refusal. The Luddites is a great example. The idea of Luddites as being these weavers who rejected the automation of their work, of a system of relations that focused on artisan craft that was then being scaled up, and increasingly worsening working conditions that frequently relied on child labor. It was also very polluting and whatnot. And we've seen very helpful proposals in the labor sphere for addressing this. And so in the book, we talk about the Writers Guild of America, East and West, who had a very well-known strike. That was the longest strike in the union's history. That was 148 days, in which they came in on top. The strike was not just about generative AI, but it was also about residuals that they got from streaming services. But after the strike, they were able to have a lot of control over the when and where generative AI tools could be deployed, and also how much control they could have in having to deal with these tools in the workplace. And you were on a panel with John Lopez with Data and Society, and one example that he uses in that session was the way in which writers were being asked to effectively get paid the rewrite rate for AI-generated scripts, and that is a much lower rate than writing a script from scratch, even though they would likely have to do the same amount of work, because the AI-generated scripts would just be such complete garbage. There's been other proposals, especially from National Nurses United, which is a very strong union in the US, that has done a lot of political education around AI technology, and they do a fantastic job in which they call out the specifics of the technology, including technologies of measuring patient acuity, of doing patient triage, remote patient monitoring, all these different things that get called AI, even though they're actually very specific technologies. And they're all ways to take control away from nurses and skilled clinicians to tech companies and tech startups. And hospital administrators are really excited about these tools. But NNU has very strong bargaining language against the deployment of those technologies, and they have done a lot of political education of their members. And so, one project that we're doing at DAIR now is called the Luddite Lab, or the Luddite Labor Strategies. It's effectively thinking about expanding our imagination of what it means to actually push back and actually have some kind of peer learning especially in labor, of thinking about what this means to actually push back against this incursion and this removal of control of people that know their workplaces the best. And so that's another collective movement. And there's also things like boycotts, pushing in collective refusal. There's some places in which this can't occur just because of the kind of structural pressures, but there's also ways in which consumers have pushed back on AI and have really said, we don't want this technology here. This connotes that you really don't care about us as consumers or citizens. And I think the more and more these technologies are being deployed and have some publicity around them, the more and more there is this pushback. And so, the last chapter of the book is really to give folks tools to push back on an individual level and in their collectivities.
Thank you, Alex, so much for that. I think we can open the Q&A. I have a bunch of questions still, but I think, wow, okay, folks do too. So I would say how to do this. Yeah, everyone. Laurens is going to go around with the microphone. I think we can start here and do something like this. And someone else maybe check online if there are questions. But let's start here, I would say. Maybe introduce yourself. And
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Alissa Schmiel. I'm a PhD candidate on cognitive warfare. My question, we've been talking about big tech hype, but part of the AI hype, in my opinion, is also the AI for good narrative and the connection even to the UN. And if you look into the UN news, they often frame it as the solution to the SDGs and everything. And I would love to hear your insights. Do you see some potential on it, or are you rather critical? Because we were talking about all the things the UN is actually trying to fight. So I would love to hear your insights on that. Thank you.
Yeah, really good question. I mean, the term AI for good gives away the game. Does that suggest the rest of AI is for bad? And so it really sends me when I hear this term, and it's not, and AI for good is not particularly new. I mean, we've seen this sort of tech for good, data science for good. There's all kinds of different ways in which for good is this suffix for certain technologies, right? Which would suggest that it's sort of the rest of this tech becomes for bad, right? And if you have to amend that, I mean, it really says, well, what does that mean? Is that just for profit making, for war making? What is that? And so it's really, it really kind of sends me up the wall. And even in those cases in which it's for good, I mean, there's other types of practices such as the kind of parachute science of it all, or the quote-unquote humanitarian uses of technology, which are very extractive, which things like
white saviorism,
100%. And the UNHCR, for instance, is an organization that sits on some of the most sensitive data in the world, being about refugee statuses, and is also a major investor in many kind of biometric technologies that are very harmful for refugees. So, yeah, that's the general kind of spiel on for good.
Yeah, hi. Is it on?
Yeah.
I can speak loud. Hi, I'm Deborah Weber-Wolf. I'm a professor for computer science who's now retired, and also wise woman online.
I know, this is one of our podcast regulars.
Yes.
It's very cool to see you
It's cool to see you in person, too. Yeah. And my question is, I'm seeing AI systems being shoved down our throats every direction, which way. And as computer scientists, we can usually figure out some way, let's use no AI in front of DuckDuckGo, or turn off the AI overview that Google keeps spitting out and stuff like that. But people who aren't computer scientists, how do we reach them? How do we help them? How can we keep them from getting this all pushed down their throats?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really good question, and thank you so much for asking it. And I think, there's one reason we wrote the book was to make it a bit more accessible. But even books are very hard to have that kind of circulation. And I think there are initiatives I think are very helpful. So working with public institutions, so whether it's public libraries, having ways of distribution such as something that we are very excited about at DAIR is doing zines. So really distributing zines that talk about kind of strategies of tech resistance. And there's some zines that we have around our research philosophy. And I would say any kind of public engagement possible is very helpful. I would also say this is because I'm very pessimistic about the ways in which government actors have also been very much co-opted by this kind of idea of ensuring that there's just light touch regulation when it comes to AI. And we saw this very much in terms of the last AI summit in Paris, which was more about how do we build AI for France than how do we build AI that has any kind of way of being accountable to people. So I think public education in whatever guise is very helpful. And I mean, it would be very helpful too. I think folks like you have a very important role too, as someone that understands the technical abilities and technical discussions here of trying to find other venues in your community to communicate that. So I think it's important to find venues where they are.
Thank you. I'm Gaurav from India as a guest researcher at Stiftung Politik. My question is actually on the Global South. There is already a race, and the dominance is already of the North, and half the work is being done in the South. I mean, thank you for these references. And the political actors are already bought in. I think the question remains, for me, it is like, how do you slow the race? It's not stopping it. It's just slowing down that dominance factor and the race itself. And India as a country, in a sense of, being looked upon as a global South, by at least the African nation state and East Asians, that what India does, what succeeds in India in AI, might as well succeed for us. So thanks.
Yeah, no, this is an excellent question, and I don't have a good answer for this just a priori, because I think this is especially. I mean, this is not I think the helpful referent here is thinking about the ways in which this has been this kind of, it's almost a meme here, right? Like in India, you have to literally, chase this idea of this. And I'm thinking about Lily Irani's book, Chasing Innovation, in which it's sort of this notion of like, you have this kind of framing in which, there is, this kind of tech field, and we need to get on it, and it becomes this kind of way of elevating, what it means to be a professional, what it means to be kind of a citizen of India, and what is it, and I would say that, I don't have a good answer, but I would say that the kind of ways in which this is not, the first rodeo here, like this is not the first instance in which you are always chasing and you have these race conditions. I think the problem is that it's become so intense at this point. It seems like there's an inevitability narrative. And I'm thinking about like, what are the ways in which, what are the ways in which discourses can be interrupted in local contexts? What are the ways in which, there are counter-governance structures? In a way, I think that the places where those interventions are probably the most effective are possibly in labor unions, because that is maybe a place in which in a place where unions are so strong, like India, where there might be a way in which there's an interruption of that narrative, but I think it really has to be contextually bound to where that can be, where an intervention can be mounted. So I think corporations are bought in, the state is bought in. What is an alternative governance structure?
Okay, I think it's Hanna over there. Hi, Hanna.
I'm just going to stand up because I'm way far behind. Hi, I'm Sana. I'm a labor sociologist. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm just wondering, when you're talking about the AI hype and how it's sort of used by companies to push people into compliance and productivity, how does that also, this AI hype, also create or help in the consciousness of workers to sort of see the class structure and how limited control they have? I mean, that's already apparent, but how this AI hype actually pushes them away even further from means of production. And how then might workers be using some kind of AI tools for the exit strategies? You were talking about that it limits their exit strategies, but how they might be using it to circumvent, are people moving into freelance work? Are people trying to build their own tools? What kind of, self-skilling initiatives workers are sort of investing their time and effort in? So, yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And thank you for that. I think there's a way in which, it makes me think of, there's an interesting paper by Reddy Adebeba and a few other people, which talks about the roles for social computing. And one of them talks about how social computing can be a mode of synecdoche, and synecdoche kind of meaning that like there's a word that's a stand-in for a whole other set of operations. Their notion of talking about computing it for synecdoche talks about the ways in which you can talk about computing with regards to something like the allocation of welfare benefits, and it's a way to get people to care about welfare benefits. And so this is something that like Virginia Eubanks' book is very good at when she's talking about, well, she's talking about the digital poorhouse, and it's not just about that, it's about, she doesn't spend a lot of time talking about logistic regression or kind of modes of allocation, but it's saying that this is a way to accelerate this. And there's a longer history of like the digital poorhouse in which we're doing this. So the thing that I think is really brought to the fore, and I think you're absolutely right, is that the way in which AI has highlighted the role of automation, and the way of automation as being this kind of, there's a kind of continuity of automation in the way that it has led to certain kinds of decreasing of labor value. And I think that's a very helpful way in which it has highlighted that. So it's coming at a quite unfortunate time in many places in which labor unions have become at least defanged in many places, but it's also led in really exciting areas in which a lot of coalition building is happening that was not happening before. A good example is in the US, the incursion of Doge into federal government work has led to the explosion of members in the Federal Unionist Network, or FUN, and that is also, and it's a great acronym, but it's also led into the kind of interactions in which these workers then talk to the American Association of Union Professionals and the American Federation of Teachers, and people that have also focused on AI as kind of a technology of domination in many different domains. And so that's a really nice kinds of way in which the kind of dominance and the kind of continuity in automation as a tool of labor suppression and labor displacement has connected a lot of unionists and workers together. On the second thing, I think it's sort of, I've seen less of this kind of use of AI as a mode of sort of reskilling, although I think that's a narrative. What there has been a lot of interest in is thinking about ways in which there's kind of tech for sabotage almost, and there's been a few projects. So the ones we talk about in the book are Glaze and Nightshade. Those are tools that are used by artists, visual artists, who then put their quote unquote glaze their artworks, put them online. That is then being used as a means of subverting the model, so it can't actually use the image to train on the model. And a Nightshade is supposed to spoil the model training in a specific way. And then there's certain tools that are being used as a way to kind of confuse web crawlers, because one of the things that's happening now, there was this sort of agreement on the internet to abide by robots.txt as this internet convention, this idea that as a crawler, you could only access certain pages, and you'd have a domain /robots.txt. And the demands of generative AI data collection have really destroyed that norm. And there's ways in which there's some interesting work both by the Data Provenance Project, and there's another independent researcher that had looked at this, was effectively looking at the ways in which the number of sites that just prevented all crawling now or have shut that down. And a lot of other journalistic outfits have just put all their stuff behind a paywall just because they don't want it to be scooped up by these tools. There's this very interesting tool that was developed by someone, and I forget their name right now, but it's effectively made kind of this labyrinth that sends the crawler down like an infinite recurse, and actually gets it to kind of waste its time. And so there's these interesting kind of modes of tech sabotage, which I think are interesting, that I would say is also an effective way of that workers have attempted to push back, especially cultural workers, but also people who are more technically minded.
Let's take one here, maybe in this area. And also, if there are questions online, okay, perfect, thank you.
Hi, and thank you, Alex. My name is Theodore Evans. I'm a consultant, independent now, and also an artist and a poet and an activist. So I say this with these hats. I share the concerns, and I think it is important to view the technology through the lens of the capitalist systems of power that are instrumentalizing it currently for the purposes we've discussed. What I hear a lot, in this narrative, or not, within these discussions, is the idea that all AI tools are these, stochastic language generators that pull from a distribution, which is like technically correct, but there is also something very profound about language, and I feel like we have the responsibility to address kind of the truth and the lie that is that that something very interesting that is happening with large language models, or is being done by large language models, which is mostly not understood in terms of the theory around large language models and how machine learning works in general, which makes it difficult, right, to address this hype, the topic of the hype, without throwing all that out the window as well. And I suppose it's not a question, but it's a comment, and it's something that I struggle with in terms of when I, speak about critical theories of technology, when I speak about these topics, I don't know where to situate myself and how to address this hype without giving comment to that.
Yeah, I mean, so this is me very much, like thinking. This is me trying to channel Emily sufficiently because she's the linguist, right? This is why the book worked really well, because she's the linguist, I'm the sociologist. And so the kind of interesting thing happening with language is sort of the way in which LLMs conflate form and meaning. Notably, the idea here in which how language operates in the world. So when we're talking about the output here, what is output is not language, but it is word forms. And the way in which word forms then get conflated, that there's meaning behind them. The meaning, from what we know from psycholinguistics, doesn't come from merely the word forms, but the idea that we're imagining some kind of a mind behind the language. And so, thinking of that is kind of a way in which meaning making happens from some kind of an intersubjective process, so that you're imagining behind this, which is not what's happening with LLMs. So I think a big way of thinking about hype debunking is to understand that there is something happening there that is not meaning making, but it is the concatenation of a lot of word forms together. That said, that's also something that is a hard thing to puncture from that sense, and we can, again, talk about Weizenbaum, talking about people like his secretary, which there's an interesting narrative about Weizenbaum's secretary. I really want to write a one-act play about Weizenbaum's secretary. Luke Stark and I have talked about this, and just about like how the secretary is this kind of mythical figure. Anyways, complete non sequitur. But thinking about the ways in which it is not just about the debunking of this and understanding that we are people who impute the text with meaning even though there's no mind behind it. And this is something that was, Weizenbaum found with Eliza 70 years ago, that people were still, less than that, 65, thank you. And so the ways in which this is still happening, but also the ways of thinking about, if you're thinking about there's an interesting happening with language, we also have to think about like what language is and what meaning making is being made there. So I would encourage that as kind of a mechanism. There are some interesting technological things here, and there's a way to separate the wheat from the chaff here, but let's be very precise about what's happening with the technology.
Okay, yes, please, here we have a lot of questions still. If you're okay with it, Alex, I would like to collect, I don't know, let's say 3 at a time, and we go for that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being here. My name is Anna Strasser. I'm a freelance philosopher, so I'm not working at university. But I have to admit, in the beginning of the hype, I was quite fascinated. So I fine-tuned a large language model on the complete work of Daniel Dennett, and we made an experiment to find out whether people can distinguish between DigiDan and real Dan. But now I'm getting more and more skeptical. and I see all the negative stuff, what is sort of, I don't know how to phrase that, is sort of getting even worse because we are living in a capitalistic world. And so my question is maybe a little bit strange, but as a philosopher, just imagine a world without capitalism. Could you think of a good use case of any generative large language model and taking into account that they have these limitations with reliability? So I'm sitting here and still looking for a use case for what it could be good from a research perspective. And I'm of course horrified by any app I'm using is offering me now an AI assistant, and it takes so much time to get rid of those.
That's an excellent question. Okay, let's collect 2 more, and then Alex answers.
Hi. First of all, thank you. It's been great, and I'm also asking if perhaps you have copies to sell here, because I would.
Unfortunately, we don't. I'm sorry. We have 5 posters and 2 stickers.
And 2 stickers.
Yeah. So unfortunately, we were trying to work with the publisher. So, yeah, I can sign a piece of a post-it note, and then you can put it on the text. I'm sorry.
So I'm Luca. I'm a researcher in a PhD student in AI and music, and my question is around whether there is a lot of the narrative around pushing back to the dominating aspects of the technology that is around resisting, as if like Dan McQuillan has put, AI is inherently right-wing. And on the other side, there is people like Catherine D'Ignazio, Naomi Klein, and not Naomi Klein. Anyway, who think of this technology as possibly feminist, even anti-authoritarian. There is projects like Papareo in New Zealand who support local communities, indigenous communities. I wonder what's your opinion on imagining an anti-authoritarian AI, if that is part of the pushback, that could be part of it?
One more, maybe here? You get to choose, Laurens. you hold the mic, you hold the responsibility, so...
Hello, my name is Annika Merklein, and I'm a social worker and computer scientist. And I think my question fits quite well to the other two. So, do you think it is possible to somehow be engaged in AI research or in the tech field in a way, and not supporting the hype?
I love the fact that you asked this question in our class already. And the answer was not very satisfactory, I guess.
Yeah, these are great questions. So I'll start in order. So, it's very hard to imagine a non-capitalist society, first off. But it's a good thought experiment, too. And I think the kind of idea of thinking about what are possible use cases for synthetic text. I think there's very little use cases for synthetic text unless they are very highly scoped in a particular way that is verifiable, that is not environmentally ruinous, that does not rely on data centralization, does not rely on exploitation. And so when we have all those conditions in place, like what do we actually have? Well, we might have a rule for a rather small model to be used. Personally, I will say that there's a little daylight in the opinion of myself and Emily. Emily has a talk which is called ChatGPT-Y, in which he says, well, if we go through all these things, non-environmentally ruinous, good data practices, good labor practices, where are we left? And she suggests that a good use case might be having like a non-player character in a video game just saying things, which I actually think is not a good use case. Because if you've played RPGs, like how are you going to get a quest from an NPC and they tell you to like go to the town square and to do the quest and there's nothing there, as someone who plays RPGs, like I don't think that's a good use case either. I would say smaller models that might be interesting with regards to, I was in conversation with Shannon Valor 2 weeks ago, and one of the things that she cited, which I thought was interesting, but I don't know enough about, was things like particular formal proofs for mathematicians that have to be verified rather extensively might be an area in which there's novel recombinations. Now I see Weizenbaum for real is like, no, this is also a terrible use case. Yeah, it's not possible. So, yeah, so even those fall apart. So I think that's also, and I don't know enough about that to verify that. So I would say there's very little to say. I would also say the corollary to that is I'm not sure that a technology like AI could emerge in a non-capitalist society, which is kind of a strong claim, because there's no way to falsify that until we get rid of capitalism. Then we'll figure it out. Yeah, let's do it. And so thinking about what that means, but I mean, just because of the kind of ways in which the technology, or at least the dominant form of the technology, is kind of coterminous with organizations that have massive compute and data power. And I think so I mean, I'm willing to proffer that as a claim. And this way I'm actually this is me more of like an organizational sociology sort of way of thinking about this. And this is kind of a similar claim that I think, doesn't like Winner make this claim in Reactor in about like how atomic energy and has to be, is it Winner who makes this argument? Yes, it is Winner. Thank you, Lawrence. That like effectively like atomic energy cannot emerge unless you have an authoritarian organization that can manage it. And I think a similar kind of argument can be proffered from AI. The second question, I don't think McQuillan and Ignacio and Klein are necessarily oppositional. Like, I think, because I would actually say that Ignacio and Klein are much more thinking about data analysis from the perspective of thinking about things like against femicide and kind of gender violence. And I think data analysis is not a bad thing. And, in a prior life, I was I guess I still am a computational social scientist, and doing analysis of things for particular ways of informing and resisting, modes of oppression, I think are excellent uses of data. I think there's a difference between that and kind of an authoritarian mode of data, or in a way in which data informs on the most marginalized of people. And I think that's a much more different orientation. So I think McQuillan would actually support a lot of the data feminism initiatives and folks who would do work like that. And then, the last question is, can you be engaged in AI research and not be into AI hype? I've had a lot of computer scientists ask me this, and I don't have good news, because I think this is especially where the field has wholly become captured in terms of AI. So there's a problem in which AI research has dominated, computer science research. And there's interesting way. I've had conversations with people who are faculty, or they left a faculty position and they've said, I don't want to do things on AI. I want to do cybersecurity, or I want to do formal verification, or I want to do NLP. And so many of these fields have either become minimized to serve AI, or to be focused on deep learning, or to have that, or people are doing this dance in which they're flitting between academia and industry just because, that's more attractive. There's so much more money. If you want to get grants, you have to have AI. And the U.S. the places in which are getting the most money from national science directorates are AI. So it's a very upsetting thing, and it's resulting in a scientific monoculture. There's a great talk at FACT last week given by Molly Crockett, who's a cognitive neuroscientist, and her and Lisa Messeri had this great piece in Nature in which they're talking about the ways in which AI is going to completely mess up science, and they've documented this, and many of these have come to pass. And one of the points that she made in her FACT presentation is that it's become so monoculturally in focusing on, and she's focusing on cognitive neuroscience, not even computer science. But that is so dangerous from a scientific perspective. If everyone is going into this one methodology and no energy is put into programming languages and formal verification and cybersecurity and safety engineering and all these different fields that, computer science enjoyed, 15 years ago as a diversity of different fields, and if everybody's going into AI, then when the bubble bursts, what's going to happen to all these fields? There's going to be this other AI winter, and there's going to have to be a resuscitation of all these other domains that, basically fell by the wayside.
Okay, raise your hands, please. Okay, Laurens. Well done.
I am a data scientist, and I also work in tech. So I've got a perspective from the trenches rather than the ivory towers of sociologists and philosophers. And what I'm observing, or what I have observed, is that the take-up of AI among tech workers is massive. On the one hand, I see people talking about the hype about AI and being dismissive of it. And completely in contrast to that, what I observe in reality is that AI has infiltrated the field to such an extent that there are no more tasks to be given to junior developers. Internships are out of the question. And other than that, I also see AI being used as a therapeutic device. So my question is, when you talk about the hype in AI being sold to us, the proletariat, where does reality end and the hype begins?
Yeah, it's a question from Rudy from YouTube. And the question is based on a premise that, as you've been talking, AI is not very good at automating most of the jobs that we have right now. And still, we see that basically all business leaders have fallen in love with it, are investing in it, are making it the future of every single company. And the question is, why do you think they are not more critical of it? Like, why do managers and business leaders fall for hype? Is it, they're not all stupid. They didn't get to where they are because they're stupid. And I guess it relates to your question. So, yeah.
Okay, and last one. You were the first I saw.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Justina, and I work at the Weizenbaum, the VZB, which is a sister kind of institute of Weizenbaum. And I have a question regarding actually the last week's verdicts about the copyright issues, because you touch on your book also on the copyright issues, and we've been waiting a long time for those verdicts, and the two of them, the Meta verdict and the Anthropic, are largely disappointing. So my question is, what's your take on it, and where does it bring us further? Yeah, so maybe I'll be short.
Great. Hold on, taking notes. I'll start with that one. I think those are very upsetting cases. At the same time, those are, as far as I know, the Anthropic verdict, there is, so as far as I know, and I'm not a legal scholar, although I have an article in MedHebCon that was doing a bit of analysis on copyright here. To my understanding, this is a kind of a disappointing result, but it also doesn't preclude some of the practices of data collection. So I believe the Anthropic verdict suggested that the copying of the data was not fair use, but the training itself had been considered fair use, which is, a bit upsetting as an opening salvo. But it does open the door that there might be challenges based on the copying. Yeah. So say the storage. Yeah. There might be a technical way in which they sort of solve that, but that'd be very annoying. They have to collect the things, and so they'll do even more scraping. But it might still be enough to sort of affect a business model. But I think that's about the limit of what I can say about that in the analysis. We'll go backwards. So in terms of the YouTube element of it, why are employers not more critical of these technologies? They're not stupid because they got in this place of this. And I don't want to suggest that this is a kind of a matter of like false consciousness that if they just knew this, this would be the case. I will say in terms of management, like we should consider the ways in which management consultancy and kind of the packed nature of technology is not necessarily like it's not an impungement. That's not the right word. It's not really like an indictment. That's the right word. It's not an indictment necessarily of intelligence of this. It's more of understanding that there is an infrastructure and sort of tech development that does lead managers to very much operate in a pack mentality in terms of adoption of certain technologies. And if there's sort of like one of the things that is helpful, and the hype function does have an element of, is if there is an example or a certain kind of way in which the technology can be proven to do certain things like rewrite emails or to output things, and it looks like plausible language, that provides enough of a function that suggests that it can do many other things that are value creating. And the kind of allure here is to be this way in which productivity does have a, have this notion that, okay, it seems to do this well. Because it seems to do this well, we can implement it in different ways. And there does exist like a very deep consultancy infrastructure that does support that narrative. Your McKinseys or your Deloittes or your BlackRocks that do say that so much can be automated and they will help you implement this, and there will be all these tools. I think I did see some survey that suggested like people who work in AI I think it was a self-report of managers, and it was such an interesting kind of thing where it suggested that like the main pain points with like the implementation with AI was the actual implementation. There was like, and so there's a certain way in which this kind of management class does profit so much from the actual implementation, and that itself is kind of self-sustaining as a myth. The last question is helpful, and I appreciate the background. And I mean, I appreciate your view from the trenches. I did work in the trenches. I wasn't always an academic. I worked at Google for 4 years. I'm sad to say. But it did provide a very helpful insight as a means of seeing where these things were happening. I mean, I worked at Google prior to the current era, but still talked to many tech workers in the course of this work. So where does reality begin and the hype end? I mean, I think there's a lot of ways of approaching this, right? And there are a lot of the ways in which, like it would be folly to suggest that there's a kind of theory that is completely commensurate in suggesting that the higher you are in a management hierarchy, this is a generalization, of course, the higher you are in a management hierarchy, the more apt that you're going to be thinking that these tools work very well. And I would suggest that insofar as if you're someone who is not actually doing code generation or doing text generation and doing verification, then you have more of an abstraction from the output, the synthetic output. And if you have more of an abstraction of that synthetic output, there may be more of a belief that these things can do much more than they can actually do. That is, of course, not a universal suggestion, but in the ways in which there's kind of a decline in ways that you can operate in that space, especially as you suggest that junior developers and interns and people that are new to the field, those kinds of positions are evaporating. That I think has to do more with management understanding of how these tools operate than actual replacement. So I would suggest that there's more displacement happening than actual replacement. Does that make sense? And I'm happy to discuss and be challenged this in terms of what you're seeing too. Okay, say more.
This decision is not being made by the managerial class, but rather by senior software engineers. Like my friends, friends of mine, when we go drinking and we have a chat about it, they will very openly admit, I can either give a task to a junior developer and wait 4 weeks or at least 2 weeks, and then work with him or her to debug whatever they produce, or the senior developer can give the same task to ChatGPT and have it all done in maybe 10 seconds, spend 1 more hour. So it's a time saving of weeks. So it's being done by the actual developers to not get on board juniors or interns. This decision does not even go all the way up to the managerial class.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I would challenge your definition of the managerial class in that sense. I mean, in terms of where senior software developers are. But I understand that. I mean, that's an interesting thing. And I'd love to talk a little bit more too, just in terms of what you're seeing in practice.
Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left. I need you, Alex, to promise you will be super brief with your answers, and then we can take...
I will yap less.
Yeah. Then we can take, I would say, 4 questions so that we still have a couple of minutes afterwards to go have a drink and eat some pretzels. So, okay, I would say here, 4. We have 4 here. Oh, sorry. You get 1 extra pretzel.
Dagmar Monet, professor of computer science, of AI, from which I have been away in the last times, angry because how it is abused, misused. And I have sided with Weizenbaum and you and Emily and all others that are resisting and pushing back. So thank you for that. And now the question. This comes also with a high toll. A lot of people against what you say. A lot of people, losing your job, and these acts of resistance, of dissidence, this also means something that goes deep inside, that is not always the best thing you would like to have in life. So my question is, how do you cope with that? From where you find the courage to do what you are doing? Please continue doing that, because sometimes it is very simple to stand up and to resist and to show that the reality of AI is very different to what is sold and what is advertised. So I will be very happy if you can give or tell us something about the person, about you. So the one individual doing something very, very great, not being alone, but what does it mean to you?
Just very quick, my question. You said already when the AI hype will burst, when the bubble will burst. What do you think will happen to make this bubble burst? What are the developments we can look out for and hope for and see like, oh yeah, it will come? Yeah, thanks.
You actually took my question away a little bit. I was also wondering if the AI bubble bursts, so if we will see something, because I wonder if we need to understand it as like a kind of revenue maximizer, right? Like we saw like the kind of social networks, right, to kind of at one point become create revenue, which are not right now, or if we actually need to understand them more like military technology, which is not there to create capital or to further it, but to destroy it. And if this is something that like necessarily like we see also, or that we might see with regards to the OpenAI, for example, crossing out the purpose limitation to like non-military technology.
Hi, thanks. I'm James, and I really liked how you've cast doomerism and boomer/boosterism as opposite sides of the same technological determinist coin. But I'm wondering, is there any place for a critical, sophisticated doomerism that incorporates social political theory and political economy?
Well, that would be you, right? Yeah, please, let's take that last one.
Thank you. I'm Mario Günther, Assistant Professor of Philosophy in Munich and currently visiting CMU in Pittsburgh. I agree with many things you say, but I also have some, like good AI systems in mind. Maybe AlphaFold is good. Maybe there are some AI systems in medicine that are kind of a net benefit in a way. So my question is, can't we have the best of both worlds, or to what extent can we have that? Do you have an idea how we can develop valuable AI, like medical AI systems, while avoiding this small set of power-hungry actors? And to what extent is this possible, in your opinion?
Okay, great. Wow, such a great question. And Mila said I had to be brief. To your question, I don't think I'm very brave. I work at DAIR. I don't think Tim Neat's going to fire me. And so I don't know. I'm more interested in thinking about like what does it mean to be brave in workplaces in which individuals are precarious, right? And to me, it's not about. Bravery is one element of it, but the things that I think make people brave are collectivities and being able to work together and have solidarity. So solidarity is the answer. The question about the bubble bursting, what will happen to make the bubble burst? I think I guess it's sort of, for me, it's sort of like what kind of bubble this is. And there's a piece in the book where Cory Doctorow writes a piece and he says, like, what kind of bubble is AI? And his kind of belief is that it's going to burst and it's going to lead to these kind of proliferation of small models. But I worry about them going to turn it on its head because we have this massive infrastructure that's being built, right? And there has to be something with that infrastructure that gets done because they don't think, they don't want these data centers necessarily to lie fallow, right? There's a huge physical infrastructure that needs to be built and maintained. So I don't know what necessarily happens there. It could burst fast or it could burst slow, right? And we've already had an AI winter, multiple AI winters at this point, right? And we also have had multiple bubbles, right? And I don't want to do this work of forecasting. What is the old joke about Marxist economists in crises? Marxist economists have predicted 10 of the last 5 crises or whatever. And I'm not a Marxist. Yeah, that was a slow burn joke. And so I don't know what that necessarily looks like. But I do know that there's this huge gap between revenue creation and investment, right? Something like $600 billion in investment, orders of magnitude less in terms of actual revenue creation. That's why OpenAI is looking into ads, wearables, government work, military, which speaks to your question, right? And it's interesting that you frame capital destruction for military tech. No, that's the military-industrial complex. That is something that makes money, right? Critical doomerism, maybe. I guess but I guess like doomerism insofar as is there, I guess the argument that's proffering is that one can chew bubblegum and talk and walk at the same time, that you can warn about existential risk. And my pushback is that these people don't care about actually existing harms, and there's a way in which there's an economy in which there's so much money in doomerism that completely supplants concern about current harms, and that is because AI safety as a field gets a lot more money on orders of scale higher than people focusing on current harms. And there's a part in the book in which we talk about this is a bit of a nuanced argument unless you're actually within the field, in which there was a suggestion in which AI safety should be incorporated and AI ethics, which I guess, like we would fit in this field, should have this kind of rapprochement. And that's not, and there was actually kind of an article that someone wrote about a schism between the two fields. That's actually historical revisionism. There was no actual schism. It was kind of this effort to supplant that with an AI safety discussion. That's not really, that's not helpful just because there is an unequal kind of ideological playing field. And I think there's also people within AI ethics that think that we need to sort of use the language of safety to integrate. And I also think that's wrong. And I don't think that should happen, because the focus will then do this, honestly, this kind of racism without racist kind of maneuver in which there is, and I do think this is the same playbook. And so I would push back on that. The last thing is like AI for good. I think this is where the specificity is helpful in thinking about this. What does it actually mean to have these certain technologies? And I think in these cases, I will end on this hopeful note in which if there's technologies that are very specifically scoped for particular types of pattern matching, for particular types of research, I'm all for that. The ways in which there is evaluation that is done in a systematic way for particular tasks, great. The idea that there is a large machine that can be everything for everyone, that is a colonial move. That is a move that supports a particular type of organizational structure. And so, when we're talking about what the technology is, whether it's pattern matching, whether it's radiology, these things, and I should say in the prior eras of doing even things like radiology that's executed by organizations like Google, people who are practitioners in these domains, had many criticisms of those things, especially in terms of bias, in terms of evaluation, in terms of certain other things. But in cases in which we have tasks that have specific evaluations that are narrowly scoped into ways that I think are, which are discriminative rather than generative in nature, I think there is a role for those technologies. And so, ending on a hopeful note, I want to talk about Teheku Media, which is because we didn't really get to talk about them. They're an organization that that has machine translation and automatic speech recognition for speakers of the Maori language and Aotearoa, also called New Zealand, that focuses on controlling the means of infrastructure for those tools, both the compute, the data, and also respects data rights according to their community. And that is one example of a technology that we talk about as a great example in the book, and also kind of this idea of a type of organization that is building for the people who need that technology first and foremost.
Okay, before we burst into a big round of applause, I want to ask you where to get this wonderful book.
A bookstore.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't. Yeah, don't get it on Amazon.
That was the answer.
Yeah. An independent bookstore. Support your independent bookstore. Again, sorry we don't have books here. We try to get them on the publisher, but I've been told it's available in Germany. So pick it up wherever you pick up fine books.
Yes, perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you so much. It's really nice. Okay, and thank you all very, very much. This was a very, very engaged audience. Great questions. And again, thank you, Alex, for being here. It's been an honor.
The honor is all mine.
Yeah, not all mine. But let's go have something to drink and eat, and maybe we can continue to talk a little bit more. Thank you all.
Thank you.